Hello everyone, and welcome to Growing Salsa 101. I'm Brittany DeMezier, one of your food systems program coordinators with the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Office in Dubuque County. And today we're going to talk salsa gardening. Salsa is a very popular summer snack, but growing and making your own salsa isn't as simple as it sounds. Everything from the tomatoes to the peppers to the cilantro all have vastly different growing techniques. So we're going to talk about some of those tips and techniques in today's video and get you started with your own successful salsa garden. So without further ado, let's get started. So if you're watching this video, you're likely part of Dubuque County Extension's Salsa 101 program. And with that program, we've provided you with 3 different seed packets: peppers, cilantro, and tomatoes. So most of today's video is going to focus on those 3 crops. However, I realized I've left out some key ingredients in salsa, like onions, garlic, as well as some others. So if you're interested in more information on growing some of those other components, we do have separate videos, Growing Onions 101, on our YouTube channel. Just go ahead and search that, and you should be able to find that video there. So first, we're going to talk about timing. Timing is really important when starting your salsa garden. If you start all of your seeds, your peppers, tomatoes, and cilantro all on the same day, they're not going to be ready all at the same time for you to make your delicious summer salsa. So we're going to talk a little bit about timing for that. So if you were part of the Growing Salsa 101 program, you should have gotten this little inclusion in your kit. This is going to have on the very top the timeline for when to start everything, as well as a simple garden layout and some recommended varieties if you wanted to plant different varieties of tomatoes, peppers, and cilantro in the future. So the first thing that you're going to want to start with your salsa garden is peppers. Peppers can be started about 8 weeks before your last frost date. So for us here in Dubuque County, that's somewhere around May 5th to May 10th. So about 8 weeks ahead of that is going to be somewhere around March 24th. So you can start your peppers around March 24th, anywhere up until about April 25th if you're growing them indoors for transplant. Anytime after that, it's going to be pretty impractical to get them to a point where they're able to be transplanted and produce a pepper in time for you to be able to harvest them. So anytime between March 24th and April 25th is where you're going to want to plant those peppers. Tomatoes are a little bit later. You can start those 6 weeks prior to that last frost date. So for us here in Dubuque County, that's usually sometime around the first week in April. I suggested April 7th on our growing chart for this program. So sometime in there is when you can start your tomatoes. Cilantro is going to be started much later, sometime around the first part of June. June 10th would probably give you enough time to get the first flush of cilantro just in time for when your tomatoes and your peppers are ready to harvest in your garden outside. So the first thing that I'm going to suggest doing if you're starting your tomato or pepper transplants is to soak your trays with the potting soil in them about 24 hours in advance of starting to plant. You can do it as late as 2 hours in advance of starting to plant, but usually 24 hours gives a good amount of time for the soil to soak up water in order for you to plant into nice moist soil. So what I'll tend to do is go ahead and fill up a tray with some potting mix, and I've already done that for this one. Then you want to go ahead and shake it off, tamp it down, and then top it off, which I've done all of that already, and then you can go ahead and level it down. And then just go ahead and set it in a very shallow dish of water. So you can see here, this dish has just a very small amount of water in the bottom. This one here has been soaking for the last 24 hours. So I can set this one in here as our new one to get started soaking for planting later on this afternoon. So once your tray's been soaked and your soil is a little bit moist on the top, we can go ahead and get started planting our peppers. So the first thing that I suggest is going ahead and taking a blunt object. Here I'm just going to take a regular lead pencil and go ahead and make a hole about 1/4 inch down in the soil in each single one of your cells. So you'll notice here that we're using a plastic pot to start these peppers. I wouldn't recommend using a compostable pot or something like that for starting your pepper and tomato transplants, just because of the length of time that those seeds and transplants are going to be in that compostable pot. Compostable pots tend to break down pretty quickly, so they're probably going to disintegrate before you're able to transplant them outside. That's why we're going to start these in a plastic pot today. So we've made holes in the soil in our container, so the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and take our pepper seeds. So that's what they're going to look like. And go ahead and put those about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch down into our soil here. So I would recommend starting about 6 peppers if you've got a smaller garden. That way, if some of them don't germinate right away, you will have a couple backup peppers. I know it can be tempting to plant every single seed in the packet, but just keep in mind that each pepper plant is going to produce anywhere between 10 to 30 peppers, possibly more per plant. So you'll want to be sure to manage your expectations with how many peppers that you go ahead and plant. As we're filling in these peppers and covering them up, we're going to want to make sure that there's soil surrounding the entire seed. That's really important for germination purposes. You don't want there to be any air next to the seed. You want to make sure that that soil and seed contact is really, really good. So once we get them planted, we're going to go ahead and grab our watering can, and we can water them from the top. And since this has been soaking and the soil is already moist, you can see that it doesn't really bubble up when we give that first initial water. So after about 3 weeks, your peppers will probably look something like this. So these peppers were started 3.5 weeks ago. And you can see they've started to get they have their first 2 true leaves, these 2 right here, and then they've started their main leaves that are coming out right in here. So this one has about 4, this one has a couple more. These are obviously a little bit bigger. So this is about the stage that we would want to step these peppers up or transplant them. So we'll want to transplant them out of this smaller container so that their roots don't get all bound up and kind of stuck into something a little bit larger, like this 4-inch pot. So for this one, you'll want to make sure that you get a pot that has some good drainage holes in the bottom. So we're going to want to fill our pot up about halfway with soil. So this is a 3.5-inch pot. So I'm going to want to fill it up about halfway with soil. That's probably a little more than I need right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and take my transplant that I'm going to start with, and I'm going to kind of squeeze it out. You want to make sure that your root system is well developed. So this root system here is very well developed. Not so well developed that you can see the roots are starting to kind of conform to that pot. That's why we want to go ahead and step this up into a little bit larger pot so those roots have room to grow and expand. Then usually, again, that's about 3 to 4 weeks ahead of or after you've planted those seeds. So you can see I made kind of a little indentation in the middle of this pot. So I've gone ahead and just kind of did that with my finger, and then I'll go ahead and set this in the center and push it down a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and fill in with soil around that pepper plant. And kind of push it down a little bit, make sure we've got no air pockets in there. Those air pockets are not good for the roots. So we'll go ahead and finish that out. Kind of dump a little bit more soil in there. This does get a little bit messy, so you will have to be working in a space that you can easily clean. And then again, once we've gone ahead and did that, we'll go ahead and water it. You can either put it back in your watering tray where you water it from the bottom, or you can go ahead and just get this whole area here really nice and moist. And then your peppers should be in this for about 3 to 4 weeks before they're ready to be transplanted outside. The next thing that we're going to start are our tomato plants. Tomatoes you'll want to start about 2 weeks after you start the peppers, about that first week in April. You don't want to start them too much sooner than that because then they get leggy and kind of root bound, and that's not ideal for transplanting outside. Just like our peppers, we're going to go ahead and fill that tray up with water and start our tray soaking about 24 hours in advance of starting to plant. Go ahead and dump out our tomato seeds here. You can see them, how beautiful they are. And just like our peppers, we're going to go ahead and make that indentation with a blunt object right down into the soil, about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch down, so not very deep in there. Just enough so that they're just underneath the surface of the soil. Tomatoes do germinate a little bit quicker than peppers do, so you won't have to wait as long for them to pop out of the ground. But you will probably get about 5 to 6 tomato plants out of this whole 6-pack that we're planting today. So that is something to keep in mind as you're planting your tomatoes outside. One tomato plant is going to produce anywhere between 20 up to 80 tomatoes per plant, so you'll want to keep that in mind as you're planting your tomatoes outside so you don't plant too many and then be overrun with tomatoes later on in the season. It's really easy to get excited at the beginning of the year when you're planting and transplanting, but once the summer gets going, you're going to want to make sure that you've got a manageable amount of plants out in your garden. So we've got our tomato seeds planted. They're in there with some nice good seed to soil contact. We'll go ahead and water them in just a little bit. But right now we're going to talk about how to step up your tomato plants. So just like we did with the peppers, we're going to want to step up our tomato plants into a little bit larger pot. So we've got this 3.5 inch pot here that we're going to go ahead and fill up with some soil. Again, about halfway full, just like we did with the peppers. And today we're just using a standard potting mix to fill up our pots. You could use a seed starting mix if you really wanted to, but when we're stepping up our tomatoes into a larger pot, you're going to want to use something like a potting mix or something like that to get your tomatoes started. So these tomatoes were planted again about 3 weeks ago, and you can see how big they are at this point. So once they're about 3 weeks old, you'll want to go ahead and step them up into a larger container. So again, we'll squeeze the roots out the bottom. Make sure that the root system is well enough established that you can easily pull them out without, kind of damaging that root system at all. We're going to make a little indentation in our pot there. Go ahead and set the tomato in and then fill in with potting soil around the outside of that tomato plant. One thing we haven't talked very much about is the use of supplemental lights. So as you're growing your tomato and your pepper transplants, you are going to want to put them underneath some sort of grow light or supplemental light source to help develop some nice healthy transplants. If you're trying to use natural light, your plants are going to try and stretch and tend to be a little bit leggier and weaker than transplants that have been started under some supplemental light source. For tomatoes and peppers, you can have your lights on for at least 8 hours is recommended, but you can go up to 12 to 16 hours a day and not really sacrifice anything. So now we've got our tomato transplant all stepped up and ready to go. So the last thing that we're going to want to get started is our cilantro. So cilantro, it tends to favor cooler weather, so we're going to want to plant it in a container or pot so that we can easily move it into a cooler or shaded area or even indoors during those really hot summer months. So you're going to want to choose a pot that's pretty deep and fairly wide. You're not going to want a shallow pot or something that's very narrow. You're going to want to fill that pot up with quite a bit of soil so that there's plenty of space for the roots to grow. So we're going to go ahead and take our cilantro pot. This one's about 8 inches deep. Go ahead and fill it up with soil and kind of move it around in there, push it down a little bit. This one is not as important that you soak it ahead of time. And then we're going to go ahead and just take our finger and make just little indentations around the outside edge in a circle. You can make them about 1 inch apart, so these are spaced pretty close together. Cilantro doesn't really mind being close up to other plants, so we can make quite a few little holes in here to get a nice good stand of cilantro. I'll take our cilantro seeds, see right there, and then go ahead, and I usually put 2 or 3 in a hole. Cilantro, again, really doesn't mind being crowded, so you can plant them close together and it's fine. If you're growing cilantro for coriander or you're growing it for the seed, that's a little different story. Then you're going to want to put it about 6 inches apart. But if you're just growing it for the leaves, you can plant them really close together and it's not going to bother them. So we're going to go ahead and do that for our entire container here. And again, you don't want to plant it too deep down in the soil. And you're going to want to leave a little space at the top of the pot so that you've got some room in there. And go ahead and cover them up. And then this is one that's not as important that you water it from the bottom. So once they're all planted, you can go ahead and just give it a nice drink of water and then go ahead and wait, and they should be ready to go. So the next step in your salsa gardening journey is to go ahead and transplant those plants that you started from seed outside. So before you do that, you'll want to put your transplants through a process called hardening off. And that's basically just acclimating your transplants from indoors to outdoors. So you'll start by placing your plants outside during the warmer part of the day, typically between about 12 and 5 p.m. for about 2 to 3 hours, and then gradually increase the amount of time that they're spending outside each day. After you've worked your plants up to being outside for about 10 to 12 hours for a couple days, you can go ahead and leave your plants outside for a full 24 hours for a couple days. Once you've completed this, your plants should be ready to be transplanted outside as they've fully acclimated to the climate outdoors. And also during this period of hardening off, you're going to not want to water your plants as frequently. You're obviously not going to want the plants to wilt, but you won't want to give them as much water as maybe you've been giving them inside. So you'll start the hardening off process about 2 weeks before you're ready to transplant your plants into the ground. So on our timeline, I've got you transplanting outside sometime around May 17th. The danger of frost is pretty minimal in northeast Iowa at that point. So somewhere around that third week in May is going to be ideal for transplanting your tomatoes and peppers. So you want to start hardening off your plants around that first week in May sometime. On our timeline, I've got May 3rd, but use your best judgment in terms of when temperatures are falling, or if there's a danger of frost, obviously keep those plants inside. This is kind of a potential layout for your garden as you're going ahead and transplanting. So the spacing that you're going to want to keep between those tomato plants is somewhere between 18 to 24 inches, so about 1.5 feet to 2 feet between plants. If you've got determinants, they tend to take up a little bit more space width-wise. Indeterminants tend to grow more up than out, so you can keep them at a little closer spacing, but somewhere between the 18 to 24 inches is ideal for tomatoes. You will want to make sure you've got a good 3 to 4 foot row in between those tomato plants as peppers as well, to make sure you've got enough room to work in between those plants, but also to improve airflow, so you've got some good airflow in there and you aren't going to be as susceptible to disease. So the layout that you see here has 2 rows. You've got 6 tomato plants and 2 peppers. It should be plenty for producing salsa. And then you've got some onions along the side as well. I know we didn't talk about onions in today's video, but if you are growing onions as well for your salsa, planting those off to the side, again, 4 foot spacing away from that other row, and planting those onions about 3 to 4 inches apart is going to be great. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at is some different diseases and pest issues that you might encounter as you're growing your salsa garden. So we're going to focus mainly on tomatoes today, since that seems to be the one that gets the most diseases out of the 3 that we're talking about in this video, tomatoes, peppers, and cilantro. But no, if you do have any issues throughout the growing season as you're growing any of your crops, you can always send pictures or bring in samples to our Dubuque County Extension office here, and we're happy to help you identify the disease or problem that's going on and give you some tips for management of that disease as it's coming through your garden. The first one that we're going to talk about is Septoria leaf spot, and this is going to be showcased here with these dark spot-like lesions on your tomato plant. It's going to have a light center. It doesn't really affect the stem of the plant or the fruit, so it's mostly just going to be these spots on the leaves. Typically this will show up right when your plants start to set fruit. Heavily infected leaves are going to turn yellow and kind of fall off. Lower leaves are going to be infected first, and obviously the disease will move upward from those lower leaves. This is caused by warm, wet conditions, so typically what you're going to see during the summertime. So if we have a really wet summer, you might see this show up. You might also see this next disease, early blight, show up on your plants. So this is another fungal disease, really common on plants in Iowa. Spots will frequently kind of merge and form blotches. So you can see that starting to happen here. This one is characterized by dark concentric circles appearing by the leaves. So they won't have a light center, but they will kind of form concentric circles around themselves. as the plant gets more heavily infected. Again, these will start first on the lower leaves and kind of work its way upward. This will affect the fruit, so your fruit can start to show those classic concentric rings as well, with some sunken areas and just some black appearance on the fruit. Again, warm, wet weather is what's going to cause this to kind of set in, but usually cultural practices can, like removing the leaves and just keeping your plants really clean and pruning them so that there's some good airflow, can help manage this disease. The worst one of the three is going to be late blight, and late blight is not just early blight advanced, it's its own separate disease. And this disease is going to affect all three parts of the plant. So it's going to affect the leaves, stem, and the fruit. So it's pretty devastating if you do get late blight on your plants. This is a wind-borne pathogen, and the first thing you'll probably notice is damage to the leaves. So the leaves will almost look like they have frost damage. So they'll kind of turn brown and almost black and kind of shrivel and curl up. If you flip the leaf over on the inside, you can see that kind of white mold type appearance, like a downy growth on the bottom of that leaf. It'll also show up on the stems. The stems will turn brown, black, and get that mold growth on it as well. And then your fruit will also start to kind of have some irregularly shaped brown blotches on it and kind of look like it's either got bruised or is rotting. So those are all symptoms that you'll see in late blight. Late blight does move very fast, so if you do start to see some of these issues on your plants, it's a good idea to get that disease identified. And if it is indeed late blight, to get those plants pulled out of your garden so that they don't infect anything further or overwinter in your soil so that they show up the next growing season. So that's some things to keep in mind with late blight. The next problem that we're going to take a look at is called blossom end rot. So most gardeners have seen this at some point or another in their garden, and basically it's just a brown or blackish spot on the underside where the blossom is on your tomatoes, or it can also show up on peppers as well. And this is due to a calcium deficiency in the plant, and usually people hear calcium deficiency and they'll think, oh, I need to amend my soil, but that might not necessarily be the case. Usually calcium deficiency shows up with inconsistent watering, and it affects the plant's ability to take up the calcium into the plant. So sorting out that watering and making your watering a little bit more consistent can really help deter some blossom end rot from occurring. So in some cases, calcium supplements can help, but I would start by adjusting the watering frequency of your plants and then kind of go from there. Another devastating one for tomatoes is going to be tomato hornworm. If you see these on your plants, there's actually two in this picture. If you can spot both of them, they will completely defoliate your plant. So they'll just start munching away at the leaves. And if you start to see leaves missing or holes in leaves, or you might see little black droppings from these worms, you'll know that you've got tomato hornworm. Basically, the easiest way to get rid of these is to pick them off as you start to find them in your gardens, because they will defoliate your plant pretty quickly. If you do see some hornworms with these little white kind of pillow looking things on their back, that's actually a good sign. So what's happening here is a parasitic wasp is going ahead and laying its eggs on the tomato hornworm, and then as those eggs hatch, as the larvae hatch, they're eating that hornworm from the inside out. So if you start to see these little white things on the backside of the hornworms that you're picking off, that's actually a really good sign that you have some beneficial insects in your garden that are taking care of this problem for you. And again, there's a ton of different tomato diseases and disorders, so we do have a whole publication on this. It's about 10 pages long that's available on our extension store that you can go through and kind of look at and start to preliminarily identify some of the issues you might be seeing in your garden. As I mentioned before, you're always welcome to bring in samples or send us pictures here at the Dubuque County Extension Office, and we're happy to take a look at your plants and help identify what might be going on with them and how to treat some of those issues. So once you get to the end of the season, you'll see your tomatoes and peppers start to form fruit and look like they're ready to harvest. So a couple tips for harvesting your tomatoes and peppers. So with your tomatoes, if you're looking to store your tomatoes for a while, you're going to want to harvest them at about 60% color. So this right here is about 90% color. So if you see, this part is a little bit lighter on the top, but the bottom is pretty red. That's about 60% color. So that 60% range is where you want to harvest if you're looking to keep them on your counter or shelf for a while. If you're looking to harvest them right away, obviously something like this where it's nice and full and red is going to be your best option. Again, if you're looking to keep them for a while, you can always harvest them with this whole thing attached. That helps preserve the life a little bit longer, or you can always, snip it off. It's best to keep this green part attached, so this, when they come apart like this allows for disease to harbor. So if you can keep this green part attached until you're ready to use it, that's ideal. Another tip, if you have a lot of tomatoes and you're looking to kind of preserve them over time, storing them stem side down or with this blossom end up is going to be the best when you're storing them. If you store them like this with that blossom end up and the stem end down, that's going to be the best way to preserve those tomatoes as they grow. Peppers are a little different story. They are going to harvest kind of continually. The cool thing about peppers is if you leave them on the vine longer, the more they change color, the riper they get, and for bell peppers, the sweeter they get. So for something like this is a green bell pepper. If we leave this on the plant over time, or even sometimes on your counter, they can begin to change colors. So they'll change colors into this like red or an orange type color that will be a little bit sweeter and a little bit more thin-skinned over time. So that's another tip with peppers. What we've included in your packet today are mostly sweet peppers. There's been a few with hot peppers included, like our jalapenos. Those are pretty easy. These don't change colors. Bell peppers typically do, but jalapenos will pretty much stay green. So if you see them get to about this size, that is usually a pretty good indication that they're ready to harvest. Firmness is another good one. If they're getting soft, you don't want that, so you want to harvest them when they're nice and firm, like this one is right here. And then finally, cilantro. Cilantro is pretty easy to harvest. You'll just want to go ahead and harvest it at the base of the plant. Go ahead and just snip it off there at the bottom. And then you can use these leaves. You can just take them, chop them right up, and then they'll be ready to go into your salsa. So hopefully now you have everything, your peppers, your tomatoes, and your cilantro all ready at the same time to go ahead and make that salsa. I hope you've enjoyed this video and enjoy growing your salsa garden this summer. Feel free to reach out with any comments, questions, or to update us on your growing progress in your garden here at Dubuque County Extension. Until next time, happy growing, everybody.